the Hollowborn throne. Briar Voss had never feared the wolves that lingered at the forest's edge, the ones that never crossed into town. But on the night of the lunar eclipse, the boundary broke. The torches flickered, the air shifted. And when she turned, he was there golden-eyed, broad-shouldered, stepping through the mist as if he had been waiting for her all along. "You were chosen," he murmured, "and I have come to collect." Chapter 1. The Eclipse and the Broken Boundary. The air hung heavy with the scent of impending rain, a thick, almost palpable tension that mirrored the knot in Briar Voss's stomach. She adjusted the thick woolen shawl around her shoulders, the familiar itch of the fabric a small comfort against the growing unease. The annual Harvest Festival was always a bittersweet affair, a celebration of bounty tinged with the encroaching darkness of winter, but tonight felt different. Tonight felt charged. Briar, at 57, felt every one of her years tonight. The lines etched around her kind, hazel eyes and the silver threading through her auburn braids spoke of a life lived, a life marked by both quiet joys and profound losses. The loss of her husband, Thomas, 5 years prior, still echoed in the hollow spaces of her heart, a dull ache that flared up on nights like these, when the world felt poised on the brink of something unknown. The townsfolk of Oakhaven had gathered in the square, their faces illuminated by the flickering torchlight. Laughter and music, usually so vibrant, seemed muted, strained, as if everyone felt the same oppressive weight in the air. Children clung to their parents' legs, their wide eyes reflecting the growing darkness as the moon began its slow, inexorable slide into the Earth's shadow. A lunar eclipse, a rare event, steeped in folklore and whispered warnings. Briar had always scoffed at the old wives' tales, the ones that spoke of the Hollowborn wolves, creatures of immense size and power said to roam the Blackwood Forest, the dark, untamed wilderness that bordered Oakhaven. They were stories to frighten children, she'd always believed, nothing more. The wolves, real wolves, kept to their territory, a silent, unseen presence that never encroached upon the town. A boundary, unspoken but understood, existed between them. "Nervous, Briar?" A voice rumbled beside her. It was Elias, the town blacksmith, a mountain of a man with a gentle heart. He'd been a friend to Thomas, and a steadfast presence in Briar's life since his passing. Briar managed a weak smile. "Just the eclipse, Elias. Makes everything feel off." Elias nodded, his gaze fixed on the darkening sky. Old Martha says it's a night for spirits to walk free, for boundaries to blur." Briar shivered, pulling her shawl tighter. Old Martha, the town's resident herbalist and purveyor of ancient wisdom, was often dismissed as eccentric, but her words carried a weight tonight, a resonance that sent a chill down Briar's spine. As the last sliver of the moon disappeared, plunging Oakhaven into an unnatural, velvety darkness, a collective gasp rose from the crowd. The torches, usually so reliable, sputtered and flickered wildly, casting dancing shadows that seemed to writhe and twist with a life of their own. The air grew colder, a biting wind whipping through the square, carrying with it the scent of pine needles and something else, something wild and untamed. Fear, raw and primal, rippled through the crowd. The music died completely, replaced by a silence so profound it was almost deafening. Then a howl, long, mournful, and closer than any wolf had ever dared to venture before. It echoed through the square, bouncing off the timber-framed houses, settling deep within Briar's bones. Panic erupted. People screamed, scrambling for safety, their faces contorted in terror. Briar found herself pushed and shoved, the crowd a surging tide threatening to pull her under. She stumbled, her hand reaching out for something, anything, to steady herself. And then she saw him. He emerged from the mist that had inexplicably rolled into the square, a figure of imposing height and power. He moved with a fluid grace that was both terrifying and mesmerizing, his shoulders broad, his presence radiating an aura of controlled strength. His hair was the color of dark oak, falling around his face in thick waves, framing features that were both rugged and strikingly handsome. But it was his eyes that held her captive. Eyes of the purest, most luminous gold, burning with an intensity that seemed to pierce through her very soul.
He was no ordinary man.
The crowd parted before him, as if repelled by an invisible force. He moved towards Briar, his gaze unwavering, his steps purposeful. He stopped directly in front of her, the scent of pine and something wilder, something animal, filling her senses. The air crackled with an energy she couldn't comprehend, a silent hum that vibrated deep within her chest. He reached out, his hand large and calloused, yet his touch, when his fingers brushed against her arm, was surprisingly gentle. A jolt, like static electricity, ran through her, leaving her breathless. "You were chosen," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant rumble that seemed to vibrate through the very ground beneath her feet. The words were strange, unsettling, yet they carried a weight of inevitability that sent a shiver of both fear and something else, something akin to recognition, down her spine. He looked deep into her eyes, his golden gaze holding her captive. She found herself unable to speak, unable to move, caught in the magnetic pull of his presence. The chaos of the square seemed to fade away, the screams and shouts receding into a distant hum. There was only him, and the undeniable, terrifying truth in his words. "And I have come to collect," he said, his voice firm, his gaze never breaking contact. Briar felt a strange calm descend upon her, a sense of surrender mixed with a burgeoning curiosity. The fear hadn't vanished, but it was tempered by something else, something she couldn't quite name. It was as if, in that moment, standing before this impossible stranger, a part of her, long dormant, had awakened. A piercing howl, closer this time, a shriek of possessive sound, ripped through the hushed mist around them, leaving Briar's heart pounding, a frightened bird trapped in her chest. What had she been chosen for? Chapter 2. Whispers of a Forgotten Pact. The howl seemed to hang in the air, a tangible vibration that resonated in Briar's bones, even after the sound itself had faded. The stranger, the man with the golden eyes, didn't flinch. He simply tightened his grip on her arm, not painfully, but possessively, as if staking a claim. "Come," he said, his voice still low, but with an undercurrent of urgency. "We must leave before they arrive."
"They?"
Briar finally found her voice, though it trembled slightly. "Who are they?" He didn't answer, instead turning and pulling her gently, but firmly, towards the edge of the square, towards the swirling mist that now obscured the familiar outlines of Oakhaven. She stumbled after him, her mind reeling. The fear was back, full force, battling with that strange, unsettling sense of rightness. As they moved, she glanced back at the square. The townsfolk were still in a state of panic, but their attention was no longer focused on her. They were looking towards the forest, their faces pale with terror. Briar followed their gaze and saw them shadows moving within the trees, large, hulking shapes that were undeniably lupin, but far larger, far more menacing than any wolf she had ever seen. The stranger, her captor, she supposed pulled her faster, his long strides forcing her to almost run to keep up. They entered the mist, and the world shifted. The sounds of the town faded, replaced by the rustling of leaves, the snapping of twigs underfoot, and the heavy, rhythmic breathing of the man beside her. "Who are you?" Briar asked, her voice breathless. "What do you want?" He finally slowed his pace, though he didn't release her arm. They were deep in the mist now, the trees of the Blackwood forest looming around them like silent, watchful giants. "My name is Ryland," he said, his voice a low rumble that seemed to blend with the sounds of the forest. "And as for what I want what is rightfully mine. What was promised." "Promised?" Briar felt a knot of dread tighten in her stomach. "I don't understand." Ryland stopped, turning to face her. The mist swirled around them, creating an ethereal, almost otherworldly atmosphere. His golden eyes, even in the dim light, seemed to glow with an inner fire. "There was a pact," he said, his voice laced with a weariness that seemed to go beyond his years, however many that may have been. "Made long ago, between your ancestors and mine. a pact to ensure peace, to maintain the balance between our worlds. Briar stared at him, her mind struggling to grasp his words. Ancestors? Pacts? Balance? It sounded like something out of old Martha stories, the ones she had always dismissed as folklore. Well, what kind of pact? She managed to ask. Ryland's gaze drifted towards the silver ring on her left hand, the simple band that Thomas had given her on their wedding day. It was the only piece of jewelry she wore, a constant reminder of the love they had shared. A marriage pact, he said, his voice softening slightly. A bond between a woman of Oakhaven and a Hollowfang. Briar's breath caught in her throat. Hollowfang. The name sent a shiver of fear down her spine, but it also sparked a flicker of something else. A strange, unsettling familiarity. But that's impossible, she whispered. Those are just stories. Ryland's expression hardened. Stories that have been carefully guarded, twisted, and forgotten. But the truth remains. The pact was broken generations ago, and the consequences have been dire. He looked out into the forest, his gaze piercing the darkness. The wolves you saw, the ones that encroached upon your town, they are a symptom of that broken pact. A sign of the growing imbalance. And only by fulfilling the original agreement can we hope to restore it. Briar felt a wave of dizziness wash over her. This was madness. She was a widow, a woman of Oakhaven, not some sacrifice in an ancient, supernatural bargain. I don't believe you, she said, her voice shaking. I won't believe you. Ryland turned back to her, his golden eyes intense. You don't have to believe me, Briar. You just have to feel it. The connection. The pull. It's been there, all your life, dormant, waiting for this moment. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the lines etched by time and grief. His touch was warm, surprisingly gentle, and it sent a jolt of electricity through her, a sensation that was both terrifying and strangely comforting. You are the Hollowfang's bride, he said, his voice a low, hypnotic murmur. And I am here to claim you. A low growl, coming from a short distance, cut him short. Ryland stiffened, his senses seemingly going on full alert, golden eyes darting to search the surrounding area. He drew her closer, standing protectively in front of Briar. We need to move, he said, and it wasn't a suggestion.
Now.
He had no time to explain more, the urgency clear. They had to flee. Where would they even run to? Chapter 3. The Scent of Pine and Wolf. Ryland's grip tightened on her arm, not painfully, but with a resolute firmness that left no room for argument. He moved swiftly, pulling her along a narrow, winding path that seemed to appear and disappear within the swirling mist. The scent of pine was overwhelming now, sharp and clean, mingled with the musky, earthy scent of damp soil and that underlying, unsettlingly animalistic aroma that clung to Ryland himself. It was a scent that both repelled and intrigued her, a primal fragrance that stirred something deep within her, something she couldn't quite name. Briar stumbled, her breath catching in her throat as she struggled to keep up with his long strides. The forest floor was uneven, roots and fallen branches snagging at her boots. Fear, cold and sharp, clawed at her throat, but it was mingled with a strange, burgeoning sense of adventure. This was insanity, she knew, but a part of her, the part that had felt stifled and numb for so long, was thrillingly, terrifyingly alive. Where are we going? She gasped, her voice barely a whisper above the rustling of leaves. Somewhere safe, Ryland replied, his voice terse. He didn't look back, his gaze constantly scanning the surrounding trees, his body tense and alert. They moved deeper into the blackwood forest, the trees growing taller and denser, their branches interwoven overhead, creating a canopy that blotted out the last vestiges of the eclipsed night sky. The mist thickened, swirling around them like a living entity, obscuring the path ahead and muffling the sounds of the forest. Briar felt a prickle of unease, a sense of being watched. She glanced over her shoulder, but saw nothing but the swirling mist and the dark, looming shapes of the trees. Still, the feeling persisted, a primal instinct warning her of danger. They're following us, aren't they? she asked, her voice trembling. Ryland nodded, his jaw tight. The pact, they don't accept the old ways. They see the pact as a weakness, a betrayal. They want to end the line. End the line? Briar's heart pounded against her ribs. What does that mean? It means, Ryland said, his voice grim, that they want to eliminate any possibility of the pact being fulfilled. And that includes you. The words hung in the air, heavy and ominous. Briar felt a chill run down her spine, a cold realization of the danger she was in. She was not just a captive, she was a target. They continued to move, the silence broken only by their hurried footsteps and the occasional snap of a twig. Briar's mind raced, trying to make sense of the impossible situation she found herself in. A marriage pact. A broken curse. A pack of monstrous wolves hunting her. It was all too much, too fantastical to be real. Yet, the reality of Ryland's presence, the palpable tension in his body, the wild, untamed scent of him, the strange, undeniable pull she felt towards him, it all pointed to a truth she could no longer deny. This was happening. This was real. After what felt like an eternity, they reached a small clearing. In the center stood a cottage, its stone walls covered in ivy, its windows dark and empty. It looked ancient, as if it had grown organically from the forest floor, a part of the landscape itself. Smoke curled lazily from the chimney, a sign of life within. Ryland stopped at the edge of the clearing, his hand still firmly gripping Briar's arm. He scanned the area carefully, his golden eyes narrowed, his senses on high alert. "We'll be safe here for now," he said, his voice low. He led her towards the cottage, his movements cautious and deliberate. As they approached, Briar could see that the cottage, despite its age, was well maintained. A small garden, filled with herbs and late-blooming flowers, surrounded the front, a splash of color against the muted tones of the forest. Ryland pushed open the heavy wooden door, which creaked ominously on its hinges. He pulled Briar inside, quickly closing and bolting the door behind them. The interior of the cottage was surprisingly warm and inviting. A fire crackled merrily in a large stone hearth, casting a warm, flickering glow over the room. The furnishings were simple but comfortable, a worn leather armchair, a wooden table, a few shelves filled with books and strange, intriguing objects. The air was thick with the scent of wood smoke and herbs, a comforting, familiar aroma that eased Briar's tension slightly. Ryland released her arm, finally, and Briar took a tentative step back, her gaze sweeping the room. It was a sanctuary, a haven from the darkness and the danger that lurked outside. But it was also his domain, a place where he was in control, and she was what? His prisoner? His bride? His destiny? He was looking at her, studying her with those intense, golden eyes, and a shiver went through her, a response not entirely born of fear. It was a look that suggested something deeper, a complicated mix of need and protectiveness that made her heart skip a beat. "You're safe now," he stated, and a shadow crossed his face. It was no longer the smooth, controlled mask, but something raw and wounded. He seemed smaller, somehow vulnerable. But only for night. He met her eyes. How could she possibly be safe, even for a moment, with a man a being like him? Chapter 4. A cottage on the precipice. The silence in the cottage stretched, thick and heavy, punctuated only by the crackling fire and the faint whisper of the wind outside. Briar stood just inside the door, her back pressed against the rough wood, feeling a strange mixture of relief and apprehension. Relief at being out of the immediate danger, apprehension at the unknown that lay ahead. Ryland moved away from her, towards the hearth, where he added another log to the fire. The flames flared, casting a shadow in a dancing silhouette against the stone wall. He moved with a natural grace, a fluidity that hinted at the power he held in check. He was a creature of the wild, even in this seemingly domestic setting. Briar watched him, her mind still reeling from the events of the night. She tried to reconcile the image of the terrifying figure who had emerged from the mist with the man now standing before her, tending to the fire with a quiet, almost melancholic air. This cottage, she began, her voice hesitant. Is it yours? Ryland nodded, his back still to her.
It was my grandmother's.
A place of refuge, she called it. A place where the old ways were remembered. He turned to face her, his golden eyes meeting hers. There was a sadness in his gaze, a weariness that seemed to go beyond the immediate situation. She taught me everything I know, he continued, his voice low. About the pact, about the Hollowfangs, about the responsibility and the burden. Briar felt a flicker of sympathy for him. Despite the fear he inspired, despite the strangeness of their situation, she sensed a deep loneliness in him, a weight of expectation that he carried on his broad shoulders. Your grandmother, she knew about the pact? Ryland gave a wry smile, a fleeting expression that didn't quite reach his eyes. She was the keeper of the lore, the one who held on to the hope that it could be restored. She believed in it, even when everyone else had forgotten. He gestured towards a small, wooden chest that sat in the corner of the room. It's all in there. The history, the details of the pact, the prophecies. Prophecies. The word sent a shiver down Briar's spine. She didn't want to know about prophecies. She wanted to go back to her quiet life in Oakhaven, to the familiar comfort of her home, to the memory of her husband. I don't want to see it, she said, her voice firm. I don't want any part of this. Ryland's expression hardened. You don't have a choice, Briar. You are a part of this, whether you like it or not. The moment you were born, your fate was sealed. His words were harsh, but she sensed a desperation beneath them, a plea for understanding. He wasn't just trying to control her, he was trying to convince her, to make her see the truth as he saw it. But why me? She asked, her voice softer now. Why after all these years? Ryland walked towards her, stopping just a few feet away. The firelight flickered in his golden eyes, making them seem almost molten. Because the balance is tipping, he said, his voice intense. The power of the Hollowfangs is growing, unchecked. The old ways are fading, and the darkness is encroaching. You are the key to restoring the balance. The last descendant of the line that made the pact. He reached out and gently touched her cheek, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw. His touch was warm, sending a shiver through her, a sensation that was both unsettling and strangely comforting. There's a power in you, Briar, he said, his voice a low murmur. A power that you don't even know you possess. A power that can heal the rift, that can tame the wildness, that can save us all. His words resonated deep within her, stirring something dormant, something she had never felt before. A sense of possibility. A flicker of hope amidst the fear and uncertainty. But it was also terrifying. The weight of his words, the responsibility he was placing upon her, was overwhelming. She was just Briar Voss, a widow, a woman who had lived a quiet life, a woman who had known loss and grief, but never power. I don't know if I can, she whispered, her voice trembling. Ryland's gaze softened. He cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs gently stroking her cheekbones. You don't have to do it alone, he said, his voice a soothing balm to her frayed nerves. I'll be with you, every step of the way. His words, his touch, his presence, it was all too much. Briar felt her defenses crumbling, the walls she had built around her heart after Thomas's death starting to crack. She looked into his eyes, those mesmerizing golden eyes, and saw not a monster, not a captor, but a man burdened by a destiny he hadn't chosen, a man who was reaching out to her, not just out of duty, but out of need. A sudden, sharp rapping at the door shattered the moment, sending a jolt of fear through Briar. Ryland instantly stiffened, his body going on high alert, all tenderness vanished. Hide, he ordered in a low, harsh whisper. Behind the tapestry. He pointed towards a large, faded tapestry hanging on one of the walls. Where had that come from? It hadn't been there a moment ago. Chapter 5. Echoes in the Ancient Woods. Briar didn't hesitate. She scrambled behind the tapestry, her heart pounding against her ribs like a trapped bird. The heavy fabric fell back into place, concealing her from view, but she could still hear everything, her senses heightened by fear. The rapping came again, louder this time, more insistent. Ryland stood motionless, his body tense, his gaze fixed on the door. He looked like a predator poised to strike, his golden eyes narrowed, his muscles coiled. "Ryland?" A voice called from outside, a woman's voice, deep and resonant, with a hint of an accent Briar couldn't place. "Are you in there?" Ryland didn't answer. He waited, silent and watchful, his hand hovering near the hilt of a large knife sheathed at his hip. Briar hadn't noticed the knife before, but now, seeing it, the reality of her situation, the danger she was in, hit her with renewed force. The door creaked open, slowly, cautiously. A figure stepped inside, silhouetted against the dim light of the clearing. It was a woman, tall and slender, with long, dark hair that flowed down her back like a silken waterfall. She wore a long, flowing dress of dark green, and a silver pendant, shaped like a crescent moon, hung around her neck. "Ryland," the woman said again, her voice softer now, but still carrying an undercurrent of authority. "I know you're here. I saw the smoke from your chimney." Ryland slowly lowered his hand, his body relaxing slightly, but his gaze remained wary. "Lyra," he said, his voice flat, devoid of emotion. "What are you doing here?" The woman, Lyra, stepped further into the cottage, her eyes scanning the room. Her gaze lingered for a moment on the tapestry behind which Briar was hiding, and Briar felt a shiver of fear run down her spine. Did she know? Could she sense her presence? "I came to warn you," Lyra said, her voice low. "The pack, they know. They know about the woman." Ryland's jaw tightened. "How?" Lyra shrugged, a graceful movement of her shoulders. "They have their ways. The forest whispers, Ryland. And they listen." She walked towards him, her movements fluid and graceful, like a dancer. She stopped just a few feet away, her dark eyes meeting his golden ones. "They're coming for her," she said, her voice urgent. "You need to get her out of here. Now." Ryland's expression didn't change, but Briar could sense the tension in his body, the barely controlled anger. "I won't let them have her," he said, his voice a low growl. Lyra reached out and touched his arm, her fingers lingering on his skin. "I know you won't, but you can't fight them alone. They're too strong, too many." She looked around the cottage again, her gaze sweeping over the familiar objects, the worn furniture, the flickering firelight. There was a sadness in her eyes, a hint of regret. "This place, it holds too many memories," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "It's not safe anymore." She turned back to Ryland, her expression determined. "Take her to the sanctuary. It's the only place where she'll be truly protected." "The sanctuary?" Ryland's brow furrowed. "But that's just a legend." Lyra shook her head. "It's real, Ryland. I know it is. It's a place hidden deep within the mountains, a place where the old magic still holds sway. A place where the pack cannot reach." She stepped closer to him, her voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. "It's a place where the veil between worlds is thin, where the spirits of our ancestors still walk. A place where she can learn to control her power." Briar, listening from behind the tapestry, felt a strange mix of fear and fascination. The sanctuary, a place of ancient magic, a place where she could learn to control her power? It sounded like something out of a fairy tale, yet the urgency in Lyra's voice, the conviction in her eyes, made it seem possible. Ryland was silent for a moment, his gaze fixed on Lyra's face. He seemed to be weighing her words, considering his options. "And what about you?" he finally asked, his voice low. "Will you come with us?" Lyra shook her head, a sad smile playing on her lips. "My place is here, Ryland. I have to try to slow them down. Give you time." She reached out and touched his cheek, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw. It was a gesture of affection, of something more. Briar felt a pang of something she couldn't quite identify, a strange mix of jealousy and understanding. "Go," Lyra said, her voice firm. "Protect her. She's our only hope." She turned and walked towards the door, her movements swift and silent. She paused at the threshold, looking back at Ryland. "Be careful," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "And trust your instincts." Then, she was gone, disappearing into the mist as quickly and silently as she had appeared. Ryland stood there for a moment, staring at the closed door, his expression unreadable. Then he turned and walked towards the tapestry. He reached out and pulled it aside. Briar stood there, frozen, her eyes wide, her breath caught in her throat. She felt exposed, vulnerable, like a deer caught in the headlights. "We have to leave," he declared without any preamble, his golden eyes blazing.
Right now.
"Before they find us." He looked into the depths of her eyes. "Did you hear all of that?" he demanded. It was a question, but also an accusation. How could she explain this strange sense of hope that flickered within her, amidst the overwhelming fear? Chapter 6. The Mark of the Hollowfang. Briar nodded slowly, her throat tight with a mixture of fear and a strange, nascent excitement. "Yes," she whispered. "I heard everything." Ryland's gaze softened slightly, but the urgency remained. "Then you understand the danger we're in. We have no time to waste." He turned away from her, moving quickly around the cottage, gathering supplies. He grabbed a heavy woolen cloak from a peg by the door, a leather satchel filled with what looked like dried food and herbs, and the large knife sheathed at his hip. He moved with a practiced efficiency, his actions betraying years of living on the edge, of being prepared for anything. Briar watched him, her mind racing. The sanctuary. A place of ancient magic. A place where she could learn to control her power. It was a daunting prospect, but also intriguing. A part of her, the part that had felt numb and lifeless for so long, was yearning for something more, something meaningful. What about my things?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "My home." Ryland stopped and looked at her, his expression unreadable. "There's no time," he said, his voice flat. "And nothing there that matters now. Your life in Oakhaven is over, Briar. You must accept that." His words were harsh, but she knew he was right. There was no going back. The events of the night, the broken boundary, the wolves, Ryland himself, it had all changed everything. She was no longer just Briar Voss, the widow of Oakhaven. She was something else. Something more. He handed her the woolen cloak, its fabric thick and warm.
"Put this on.
It will keep you warm and help conceal you." She slipped the cloak over her shoulders, the weight of it settling around her like a protective embrace. It smelled of wood smoke and pine, and faintly, of Ryland himself. The scent, which had once been unsettling, now felt strangely comforting. Ryland opened a small, wooden door hidden behind a bookshelf, revealing a narrow, winding staircase leading down into darkness. "This is a secret passage," he explained. "It leads to a tunnel that will take us out of the forest, closer to the mountains." He gestured for her to go first. Briar hesitated, her gaze fixed on the dark abyss below. It was a leap of faith, a descent into the unknown. But she knew she had no choice. She had to trust him. She took a deep breath and stepped onto the first step, the wood creaking under her weight. The air was cool and damp, and the darkness pressed in on her, thick and suffocating. She descended slowly, carefully, her hand gripping the rough stone wall for support. Ryland followed close behind, his presence a reassuring warmth at her back. He held a small, flickering lantern, its light casting dancing shadows on the walls of the tunnel. They walked in silence for what felt like an eternity, the only sounds their footsteps and the occasional drip of water. The tunnel twisted and turned, sloping downwards, leading them deeper and deeper into the earth. Briar felt a growing sense of claustrophobia, a primal fear of being trapped. But she pushed it down, focusing on Ryland's presence, on the steady rhythm of his breathing, on the faint, flickering light of the lantern. Finally, after what seemed like hours, the tunnel began to widen, and the air grew fresher. They emerged into a large cavern, its ceiling high and vaulted, its walls covered in strange, glowing moss. In the center of the cavern was a pool of water, its surface still and reflective, like a mirror. Ryland stopped, his gaze fixed on the pool. "This is a sacred place," he said, his voice hushed. "A place of power." He walked towards the pool, and Briar followed, her curiosity piqued. As they approached, She saw that the water was not just reflecting the light of the moss, it was glowing with its own inner light, a soft, ethereal luminescence. Ryland knelt by the edge of the pool, his hands cupping the water. He closed his eyes, his lips moving in a silent prayer. Then he looked at Briar, his golden eyes intense. "This water, it holds the memories of our ancestors," he said. "It can reveal truths." He dipped his hand into the water, and then reached out to her, touching her forehead with his wet fingers. A jolt of energy surged through her, a wave of warmth that spread from her head down to her toes. She gasped, her eyes widening. She saw images. Flashes of memories, not her own, but ancient, primal. She saw wolves, huge and powerful, running through the forest. She saw humans standing before them, unafraid. She saw a pact being made, a bond being forged, a ring being exchanged. She saw Ryland, not as he was now, but younger, wilder, his eyes burning with a fierce, untamed light. And then she saw herself, or rather, a woman who looked like her, but different. Stronger, more confident, her eyes shining with a power that Briar had never known. The woman was wearing a silver ring, identical to the one on Briar's finger. The woman reached out, touching a large, magnificent wolf on the head, and a connection, electric and intense, flowed between them. The images faded, leaving Briar breathless and trembling. She looked at Ryland, her eyes searching his. What was that?" she whispered. Ryland's expression was grave. "That was the past, Briar. The truth of who you are. The truth of the mark." He reached out and gently took her left hand, his fingers tracing the silver ring on her finger. "This ring," he said, his voice low, "it's not just a symbol of your marriage to Thomas. It's a mark of your lineage. A sign of the bond between your ancestors and the Hollowfangs." He looked into her eyes, his gaze piercing. "You are marked, Briar. Chosen. And the power of the Hollowfang flows within you." As if to emphasize his point, a low, guttural growl echoed around the cave. But this time, it did not originate from outside. It came from her. Chapter 7. Dreams of a Silver Ring. Briar stared at her hand, at the simple silver band that had suddenly become so much more than a memento of her lost love. The growl, low and resonant, still vibrated in the air, a physical manifestation of the power Ryland spoke of, a power that resided within her. It was terrifying, exhilarating, and utterly bewildering. "I don't understand," she stammered, her voice trembling.
How can that be?"
Ryland's grip on her hand tightened, a reassuring pressure. "It's in your blood, Briar. Passed down through generations, dormant until now. The eclipse had awakened something within you. It broke the seal." He released her hand and stood, pulling her up with him. "We need to keep moving. The sanctuary is still far, and the pack will be searching for us." They left the cavern, following another tunnel that led upwards, gradually ascending towards the surface. The air grew colder, and Briar could hear the wind whistling through cracks in the rock. The comforting, earthy scent of the tunnels was replaced by the sharp, clean scent of pine and the crisp, almost metallic tang of mountain air. As they walked, Ryland began to explain more about the sanctuary, about the old magic that protected it, about the challenges they would face. He spoke of hidden paths, of treacherous terrain, of ancient guardians that tested the worthiness of those who sought entry. Briar listened, her mind struggling to absorb it all. It was a world of magic and danger, a world she had never imagined existed, a world she was now inextricably bound to. They emerged from the tunnel onto a narrow ledge, high on the side of a mountain. The view was breathtaking. Below them, the blackwood forest stretched out like a vast, dark ocean, its trees shrouded in mist. Above them, the peaks of the mountains rose into the sky, their snow-capped summits gleaming in the faint light of the dawn. Briar felt a sense of awe, of wonder, at the sheer scale and beauty of the landscape. It was a world away from the familiar, comforting confines of Oakhaven, a world that both terrified and exhilarated her. They continued their journey, following a narrow, winding path that clung precariously to the mountainside. The wind whipped around them, cold and fierce, and the drop below was dizzying. Briar focused on putting one foot in front of the other, on trusting Ryland's lead, on ignoring the fear that gnawed at her edges. As the day wore on, exhaustion began to set in. Briar's muscles ached, her feet were sore, and her head throbbed. She hadn't slept in what felt like days, and the constant stress and fear were taking their toll. Ryland, sensing her fatigue, stopped at a small, sheltered alcove in the rock face. "We'll rest here for a while," he said, his voice softer now, his concern evident. He helped her sit down, and she leaned back against the cold stone, closing her eyes. She felt utterly drained, both physically and emotionally. "Try to sleep," Ryland said, his voice a low murmur. "I'll keep watch." Briar nodded, her eyelids heavy. She drifted in and out of a fitful sleep, plagued by strange, vivid dreams. She dreamt of the silver ring, glowing with an unearthly light. She dreamt of the woman in the cavern, the woman who looked like her, but stronger, more powerful. She dreamt of wolves, running through the forest, their eyes burning with a fierce, golden light. And she dreamt of Ryland, his face both familiar and strange, his touch both terrifying and comforting. In one dream, she stood before a vast, ancient tree, its branches reaching up to the sky like gnarled fingers. The tree was pulsing with light, and she felt a powerful draw towards it, a sense of belonging. She reached out to touch the trunk, and as her fingers brushed against the bark, a voice whispered in her ear, a woman's voice, deep and resonant. "The power is within you," the voice said. "Embrace it. Become it." Briar woke with a start, her heart pounding, her breath coming in ragged gasps. Ryland was sitting beside her, his hand resting on her arm, his golden eyes filled with concern. "Are you all right?" he asked, his voice gentle. Briar shook her head, trying to shake off the lingering images of the dream. "Just a dream," she whispered. "A strange dream." She looked at her hand, at the silver ring. It seemed to shimmer in the dim light of the alcove, as if resonating with the echoes of her dream. Ryland followed her gaze. "The ring is a connection to your power," he said. "To your ancestors. To the Hollowborn." He reached out and gently touched the ring, his fingers brushing against hers. A jolt of energy passed between them, a warm, tingling sensation that made Briar's breath catch in her throat. "You're starting to feel it, aren't you?" he asked, his voice a low murmur. "The power within you." Briar nodded, unable to speak. She was feeling it, a subtle shift within her, a growing awareness of something more. Something wild, something powerful, something that both terrified and excited her. A distant howl, echoing across the mountains, broke the spell. Ryland stiffened, his senses instantly alert. He stood up, his body tense. He looked at Briar. "They're getting closer," he said, his voice grim. The time for rest was over. How much longer could they possibly run? Chapter 8. The gathering storm within. The howl, though distant, sent a renewed surge of adrenaline through Briar. The brief respite, the unsettling dreams, the growing awareness of her own burgeoning power, all of it was overshadowed by the immediate threat of the pursuing pack. "We have to go," Ryland said, his voice urgent, but his hand gentle as he helped her to her feet. "The sanctuary is still some distance away, and we need to reach it before nightfall." They continued their ascent, the path growing steeper and more treacherous. The wind howled around them, whipping their cloaks and stinging their faces. The landscape was stark and unforgiving, a world of rock and ice and snow, with only the occasional hardy shrub or twisted tree clinging to life. Briar pushed herself onward, drawing on a reserve of strength she didn't know she possessed. The fear was still there, a constant companion, but it was mingled with a growing determination, a refusal to be defeated. She was no longer just running from something, she was running towards something. Towards the sanctuary, towards the promise of safety, towards the possibility of understanding the power that was stirring within her. As they climbed, Ryland continued to share fragments of information about the sanctuary, about the old magic that protected it, about the trials they would face. He spoke of ancient spirits, of guardians who tested the hearts and minds of those who sought entry, of a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the past and the present intertwined. Briar listened, her mind struggling to grasp the concepts he described. It was a world so far removed from her own, a world of magic and mystery, a world that challenged everything she had ever believed. But the more she learned, the more she felt a strange sense of recognition. It was as if the stories Rylan told were not entirely new to her, as if they were echoing something deep within her own memory, something ancient and primal. The dreams she had experienced, the visions in the cavern, the growing awareness of the power within her, it was all starting to make a strange, unsettling kind of sense. She was a part of this world, whether she liked it or not. She was connected to the Hollowfangs, to the ancient pact, to the magic that flowed through the mountains. As they neared the summit, the wind grew even fiercer, and the snow began to fall, thick and heavy, obscuring the path ahead. Visibility dropped to near zero, and Briar could barely see Ryland, who was just a few feet in front of her. She stumbled, her foot slipping on a patch of ice. She cried out, her hands flailing for purchase. Ryland turned instantly, his reflexes lightning fast. He grabbed her arm, pulling her back from the edge, his grip strong and reassuring. "Careful," he said, his voice tight with concern. "The path is treacherous here." He pulled her close, shielding her from the wind with his body. His warmth was a welcome comfort against the biting cold, and his presence, his strength, gave her the courage to keep going. They pressed on, slowly, cautiously, their bodies leaning into the wind. The snow swirled around them, creating a whiteout, a disorienting, claustrophobic world of swirling white. Briar felt a growing sense of unease, a primal fear of being lost, of being swallowed up by the storm. But she trusted Ryland. She had to. He was her guide, her protector, her link to this strange, new world. Suddenly, Ryland stopped. He held up his hand, signaling her to be silent. He stood perfectly still, his head cocked, his golden eyes narrowed, his senses straining. "What is it?" Briar whispered, her voice barely audible above the wind. Ryland didn't answer. He slowly drew the large knife from his sheath, the blade gleaming in the dim light. He moved forward, cautiously, his body tense and alert. Briar followed close behind, her heart pounding in her chest. She peered through the swirling snow, trying to see what he saw, but she could make out nothing but the white, blinding curtain of the storm. Then she heard it, a low growl coming from somewhere close by. Not the deep, resonant growl she had produced in the cavern, but something different. Something more menacing, more hungry. The growl was followed by another and another, until the air was filled with the sound of multiple wolves, closing in. They were surrounded. Ryland turned to her, his expression grim. "They've found us," he said, his voice low.
"Stay close to me."
He stood between her and the direction of the growls, his body a shield, his knife held ready. Briar felt a surge of fear, but also something else. A flicker of defiance, a spark of the power she had felt awakening within her. She looked at her hand, at the silver ring. It seemed to pulse with a faint, inner light, as if responding to the danger, to the presence of the wolves. She clenched her fist, feeling a strange surge of energy, a warmth that spread through her veins. A large, dark shape emerged from the swirling snow, its eyes gleaming with a predatory hunger. It was a wolf, but far larger than any wolf she had ever seen, its fur thick and matted, its teeth bared in a snarl. And behind it more shapes, more eyes, more growls. The pack had arrived. Ryland took a deep breath, air filling his powerful lungs. "Run, Briar," he shouted. "Run for the sanctuary. I'll hold them off." But where, in this blinding storm, was the sanctuary? Chapter 9. Unveiling the Hunter's Snare. Ryland's command, though desperate, ignited a spark of rebellion within Briar.
"Run?"
Abandon him to face the pack alone? After everything, after the shared danger, the growing connection, the unsettling but undeniable pull she felt towards him?
"No."
She wouldn't leave him. "I won't go," she shouted back, her voice surprisingly strong above the howling wind. "I won't leave you." Ryland turned to her, his golden eyes wide with a mixture of surprise and something else. Was it admiration? Respect? She couldn't be sure. "Briar, you have to," he began, but his words were cut short by a snarling wolf lunging towards him. He reacted instantly, his movements fluid and deadly. He sidestepped the attack, his knife flashing out, drawing a line of crimson across the wolf's flank. The wolf yelped, momentarily retreating, but the others were closing in, their eyes burning with predatory hunger. Briar watched, her heart pounding in her chest, her mind racing. She couldn't just stand there and watch him fight alone. She had to do something. She looked at her hand, at the silver ring. She remembered the visions in the cavern, the woman who looked like her, the woman who had commanded the wolf with a touch. She remembered the growl that had emanated from her own throat, the power she had felt surging within her. Could she do the same? It was a desperate gamble, a leap of faith, but she had nothing to lose. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and focused on the ring, on the feeling of the power, on the image of the woman in the vision. She opened her eyes and stepped forward, placing herself between Ryland and the attacking wolves. She raised her hand, her palm facing the closest wolf, and spoke, her voice clear and surprisingly strong.
"Stop,"
she commanded. "Stand down." The effect was stunning. The wolves, mid-snarl, hesitated. They froze, their eyes fixed on her, their bodies trembling. The growl subsided, replaced by a confused, almost submissive whine. Ryland stared at her, his expression a mixture of disbelief and awe. He lowered his knife, his gaze shifting between Briar and the wolves. "Briar, what, how?" he stammered. Briar herself was just as surprised. She hadn't expected it to work, not really. But it had. The power, the connection to the Holophong, it was real. It was hers. But the moment of reprieve was short-lived. A new figure emerged from the swirling snow, a figure that was not a wolf, but a man. He was tall and lean, with sharp, angular features and cold, calculating eyes. He wore a long, dark coat and a silver chain, adorned with various charms and talismans, hung around his neck. He looked at Briar, his lips curling into a cruel smile. Well, he said, his voice smooth and dangerous. "The Holofang's bride. I must say, I'm impressed." He raised his hand, and the wolves, who had been momentarily subdued by Briar's command, began to growl again, their eyes shifting from Briar to the man, their loyalty clearly divided. "You have power," the man continued, his gaze fixed on Briar. "But you don't know how to control it. You're a danger to yourself and to everyone around you." He took a step closer, his hand reaching inside his coat. "I'm here to help you.
"To teach you. To tame you."
Ryland stepped in front of Briar, shielding her with his body. "Stay away from her, Kaelin," he growled, his voice low and menacing. The man, Kaelin, chuckled. "Always the protector, Ryland. But you can't protect her from herself."
"Or from me."
He pulled his hand from his coat, revealing a small, silver whistle. He raised it to his lips and blew a sharp, piercing note. The sound had an immediate and devastating effect on Briar. It felt like 1,000 needles piercing her skull, a wave of pain that washed over her, stealing her breath and buckling her knees. She cried out, clutching her head, her vision blurring. Ryland turned to her, his eyes filled with alarm. "Briar." He reached for her, but Kaelin was faster. He moved with lightning speed, grabbing Briar's arm, his grip like iron. He pulled her towards him, his other hand reaching for the silver ring on her finger. "The ring," he hissed. "It amplifies her power. It's the key to controlling her." Ryland lunged at Kaelin, his knife flashing, but Kaelin sidestepped the attack with ease. He held Briar tightly, his fingers digging into her flesh. "Don't make me hurt her, Ryland," Kaelin said, his voice cold.
"Just stand down."
Ryland froze, his body tense, his eyes burning with rage. He was caught, trapped between his desire to protect Briar and his fear of harming her. Kalen smiled, a cruel, triumphant smile.
That's it, he said.
Be a good wolf. And maybe, just maybe, I'll let your little bride live. Briar, despite the pain, felt a surge of anger, of defiance. She wouldn't be controlled.
She wouldn't be tamed.
She was the Hollowfang's bride, and she would not be his prey. She focused all of her will, all her pain, on one single task: escape. But how could she possibly escape Kalen's iron grip? Chapter 10. The Price of Protection. The pain was excruciating, a searing fire that threatened to consume her. But beneath the pain, fueled by her anger and her burgeoning power, Briar felt a flicker of something else. Something primal, something wild, something that resonated with the silver ring on her finger, with the howls of the wolves, with the very essence of the Hollowfang. She focused on that feeling, on that connection, letting it grow, letting it fill her. She ignored the pain, ignored Kalen's grip, ignored Ryland's desperate pleas. She focused on the power, on the wildness, on the wolf. And then it happened. A low growl, deeper and more resonant than before, emanated from her throat. It was a sound of power, of defiance, of untamed fury. Her body began to tremble, her muscles coiling, her bones shifting. Her senses sharpened, her vision cleared, and she saw Kalen, not as a threat, but as prey. Kalen's eyes widened in surprise, then fear. He tried to tighten his grip, to pull the ring from her finger, but it was too late. Briar's hand, no longer entirely human, lashed out, her nails, now elongated and sharp, raking across his face. He cried out in pain, releasing her arm, staggering back. Ryland, seeing his opportunity, lunged forward, his knife aimed at Kalen's heart. But Kalen, despite his injury, was still quick. He dodged the blow, grabbing Ryland's wrist, twisting it with brutal force. Ryland cried out in pain, his knife clattering to the ground. Kalen kicked him, sending him sprawling backwards, his head hitting the hard rock with a sickening thud. Briar watched in horror as Ryland lay motionless, his eyes closed, blood trickling from a wound on his forehead. Rage, raw and primal, surged through her. She turned her attention back to Kalen, her eyes burning with a golden light, her body poised to strike. But Kalen was no longer looking at her. He was looking at something behind her, his eyes wide with a mixture of fear and awe. Briar turned, following his gaze, and saw them. The wolves. The pack that had been hunting them, the pack that had been under Kalen's control. They were standing there, silent and watchful, their eyes fixed on her, not with hunger, but with respect. They were no longer snarling, no longer threatening. They were submissive. They were bowing their heads, their bodies low to the ground, as if acknowledging her as their leader. Briar felt a strange connection to them, a sense of kinship. She understood them. She felt their power. She shared their wildness. She was one of them. Kalen, seeing the shift in the wolves' allegiance, knew he had lost. He backed away slowly, his eyes darting between Briar and the pack, his face pale with fear. This isn't over," he stammered, his voice trembling. "You may have won this battle, but you haven't won the war." He turned and fled, disappearing into the swirling snow, his figure swallowed up by the storm. Briar watched him go, her body still trembling with the aftershocks of the transformation. She felt exhausted, drained, but also exhilarated. She had tapped into a power she never knew she possessed, a power that had saved her and Ryland. She turned her attention to Ryland, who was still lying unconscious on the ground. She knelt beside him, her heart pounding with fear. She gently touched his face, her fingers tracing the line of his jaw, her touch now gentle. "Ryland," she whispered, her voice trembling. "Ryland, please wake up." She checked his pulse, her fingers pressing against his neck. It was weak, but steady. He was alive. She looked around, her gaze sweeping the desolate landscape. They were still exposed, vulnerable, and Ryland needed help. She had to get him to safety, to the sanctuary. But how? She was exhausted, injured, and the storm was still raging. She couldn't carry him, not in this terrain, not in this weather. Then she remembered the wolves, the pack. They were still there, watching her, waiting. Could she ask them for help? It was a desperate gamble, but she had no other choice. She stood up, facing the wolves, her body straight, her head held high. She spoke to them, not with words, but with her mind, with her heart, with the power that flowed through her. She asked for their help, for their protection, for their guidance. She showed them the image of Ryland, injured and vulnerable. She showed them the image of the sanctuary, the place of safety, the place of healing. The wolves listened, their eyes fixed on her, their bodies still. Then, the largest of the wolves, the one with the thickest fur and the most intelligent eyes, stepped forward. He lowered his head, nudging Ryland gently with his snout. Then, he looked at Briar, his eyes conveying a silent understanding. He would help. They would all help. Briar felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of gratitude that brought tears to her eyes. She had found allies in the most unexpected of places. With the wolves' assistance, she managed to get Ryland onto the large wolf's back, securing him as best she could. Then, with the pack surrounding them, protecting them from the wind and the snow, they began their journey towards the sanctuary, guided by the instincts of the wolves and the faint, flickering hope that burned within Briar's heart. The price of protection, she realized, was not just the acceptance of her own power, but the willingness to trust the wild, untamed creatures of the mountains. And to trust the bond, however fragile, she was forming with them. But would that trust extend to Ryland, once he awoke? Chapter 11. Scars Beneath the Surface. The journey to the sanctuary, guided by the pack, was a blur of snow and wind and exhaustion. Briar, clinging to the large wolf's fur, her body numb with cold, drifted in and out of consciousness. She had fleeting images of towering mountains, of hidden valleys, of ancient trees that seemed to whisper secrets to the wind. She was vaguely aware of the wolves, their steady presence a comforting reassurance in the vast, unforgiving wilderness. They moved with a sure-footed grace, navigating the treacherous terrain with ease, their bodies shielding her and Ryland from the worst of the storm. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, they reached their destination. The storm began to subside, the clouds parting to reveal a hidden valley, bathed in the soft, ethereal light of the setting sun. In the center of the valley stood a cluster of ancient stone buildings, their walls covered in moss and ivy, their roofs overgrown with wildflowers. It was a place of breathtaking beauty, a sanctuary of peace and tranquility, a world away from the violence and chaos they had left behind. The wolves led them to the largest of the buildings, a structure that resembled an ancient temple, its entrance guarded by two towering stone statues, their features worn and weathered by time. The statues depicted wolves, their heads held high, their eyes seeming to follow Briar as she approached. The large wolf carrying Ryland lowered himself to the ground, allowing Briar to gently slide Ryland off his back. She cradled him in her arms, her heart aching at the sight of his pale face, his closed eyes, the blood still matted in his hair. The doors of the temple opened silently, as if sensing their arrival. A figure emerged, silhouetted against the warm, golden light that spilled from within. It was an old woman, her face wrinkled and weathered, her eyes deep and wise, her hair as white as the snow on the mountaintops. She wore a long, flowing robe of woven wool, and a silver pendant, shaped like a crescent moon, hung around her neck. It was identical to the one Lyra wore. The woman approached them, her gaze fixed on Ryland. She knelt beside him, her hand gently touching his forehead. She closed her eyes, her lips moving in a silent prayer. Then, she looked at Briar, her eyes filled with a knowing understanding. "Welcome," she said, her voice soft but strong. "You are the Hollowfang's bride, and you have come to the right place." She gestured for the wolves to enter the temple, and they obeyed, their movements silent and respectful. The woman helped Briar carry Ryland inside, and the doors closed behind them, shutting out the cold and the darkness, embracing them in warmth and light. The interior of the temple was vast and awe-inspiring. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, depicting scenes of wolves and humans, of pacts and prophecies, of battles and betrayals. The air was thick with the scent of incense and herbs, and the silence was broken only by the crackling of a large fire that burned in a central hearth. The woman led them to a small chamber, where she gently laid Ryland on a bed of soft furs. She began to tend to his wounds, her movements skilled and efficient. She cleaned the blood from his forehead, applying a poultice of herbs that smelled of earth and mint. Briar watched her, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and anxiety. She wanted to ask so many questions about the sanctuary, about the woman, about Ryland's condition, but she was too exhausted, too overwhelmed to speak. The woman, sensing her unease, looked at her and smiled. "He will be all right," she said, her voice reassuring. "He is strong. He will heal." She gestured towards a chair beside the bed.
"Sit," she said. "Rest."
"You are safe here." Briar sank into the chair, her body aching, her mind reeling. She closed her eyes, letting the warmth of the fire, the scent of the herbs, the silence of the chamber, soothe her frayed nerves. She drifted into a fitful sleep, plagued by images of the storm, of Kaelin, of the wolves, of Ryland's pale face. She dreamt of the silver ring, glowing with an unearthly light, of the woman in the cavern, of the ancient tree that whispered secrets to the wind. When she awoke, the chamber was dimly lit by flickering candles. Ryland was still asleep, but his breathing was more regular, his color less pale. The old woman was sitting beside him, her hand resting on his forehead, her eyes closed in meditation. Briar sat up, her body stiff and sore. She looked at the woman, her heart filled with questions.
Who are you?"
she asked, her voice hesitant. The woman opened her eyes, her gaze meeting Briar's. "I am Alara," she said. "I am the keeper of this sanctuary, the guardian of the old ways." She smiled, a warm, knowing smile. "And you, Briar, are the key to restoring the balance, the one who can heal the rift between our worlds." Her words echoed Ryland's, Lyra's, the whispers in her dreams. The weight of responsibility settled upon her once more, heavier than ever. Alara stood and moved to a nearby table. She returned to Briar and pressed a warm, steaming cup into her hand.
"Drink this.
It will make you feel better." As Briar sipped the brew, which tasted of chamomile and something faintly metallic, she saw Ryland stir. His eyes fluttered open, then met her own. There was confusion in his eyes. And something else. Fear? Chapter 12. A dance of trust and treachery. Ryland's gaze, initially clouded with confusion, slowly sharpened, focusing on Briar. The fear she had glimpsed didn't vanish, if anything, it intensified, mingling with a wariness that sent a chill through her. "Briar?" he whispered, his voice hoarse. He tried to sit up, but winced, his hand going to his head. "Easy," Briar said, gently pushing him back down. "You were hurt. You're safe now. We're in the sanctuary." Alara stepped forward, her presence calming and reassuring. "You are safe here, Ryland," she said, her voice soft but firm.
"Rest.
Heal." Ryland looked from Briar to Alara, his eyes filled with questions, with suspicion. He seemed to struggle to remember what had happened, his brow furrowed in concentration. "The pack," he finally said, his voice strained. "Kaelin, what?" Briar explained, as best she could, what had transpired after he had fallen unconscious. She told him about her transformation, about the wolves' submission, about their journey to the sanctuary. She spoke hesitantly, watching his reaction closely, fearing his judgment, his rejection. Ryland listened in silence, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt, didn't question her, but his gaze never left her face, his eyes searching, probing. When she had finished, he was silent for a long moment, his gaze drifting to the silver ring on her finger. He reached out, his hand trembling slightly, and gently touched the ring. A flicker of something passed between them, a spark of connection, but it was quickly overshadowed by his fear. You changed, he said, his voice barely a whisper. You became one of them. His words were not an accusation, but a statement of fact, tinged with a profound sadness, a sense of loss. Briar felt a pang of guilt, of shame. She had embraced the power, the wildness, and in doing so, she had crossed a line, a boundary that separated her from him, from the human world. I had to, she said, her voice trembling. To save you. To save us. Ryland didn't reply. He closed his eyes, his face pale, his breathing shallow. He seemed to withdraw into himself, shutting her out. Alara, sensing the tension, intervened. He needs rest, she said, her voice gentle but firm. Leave him now. We will talk more later. Briar hesitated, wanting to stay, to explain, to reassure him, but she knew Alara was right. Ryland needed time, space, to process what had happened, to come to terms with the change in her, in their relationship. She stood up, her legs feeling weak and unsteady. She looked at Ryland one last time, her heart aching at the fear and distance in his eyes. Then, she turned and followed Alara out of the chamber. Alara led her to another room, smaller and more sparsely furnished, but still comfortable and warm. There was a bed, a chair, a small table, and a window that looked out onto the valley, bathed in the soft light of the moon. You need rest too, Alara said. You have been through much.
She gestured towards the bed.
Sleep. We will talk in the morning. Briar nodded, too exhausted to argue. She undressed, slipping into the soft furs of the bed, her body aching, her mind racing. She closed her eyes, but sleep wouldn't come. She kept seeing Ryland's face, his eyes filled with fear, with disappointment. She kept hearing his words, you changed. Had she changed too much? Had she lost him in saving him? The questions haunted her, swirling around in her mind, keeping her awake. She tossed and turned, her sleep fitful and plagued by nightmares. When she finally drifted off, she dreamt of Kalen, his cruel smile, his silver whistle, his attempts to control her. She dreamt of the wolves, their eyes burning with a golden light, their loyalty shifting, their power at her command. And she dreamt of Ryland, his face both familiar and strange, his touch both comforting and distant. She dreamt of him turning away from her, walking into the darkness, leaving her alone. She woke with a start, her heart pounding, her body covered in a cold sweat. The room was still dark, the moon casting long shadows across the floor. She sat up, her mind racing, her heart aching. She couldn't stay here, in this room, in this sanctuary, haunted by her fears, by her doubts, by the distance between her and Ryland. She had to do something, she had to prove herself. She got out of bed, dressed quickly, and slipped out of the room. She moved silently through the temple, guided by the faint light of the moon and the flickering candles. She found her way to the main hall, where the fire still burned in the central hearth. She stood there for a moment, looking at the ancient carvings on the walls, the depictions of wolves and humans, of pacts and prophecies. She felt a strange connection to this place, to the old magic that permeated it, to the spirits of her ancestors that seemed to whisper to her from the shadows. She knew what she had to do. She had to find Kalen. She had to stop him. She had to prove to Ryland and to herself that she could control the power, that she could use it for good, that she was not a monster. It was a reckless plan, a dangerous plan, but she couldn't see any other way. She had to face her fears, confront her enemy, and reclaim her destiny. She slipped out of the temple, into the cold night air. The wolves were waiting for her, their eyes gleaming in the moonlight. They seemed to understand her purpose, her determination. They would help her. They would guide her. They would be her allies, her protectors, in this dangerous, uncertain quest. But it was Ryland's alliance that mattered most of all. How much further into the darkness would she have to venture to earn that back? Chapter 13. The Moonlit Confession. The wolves moved with a silent grace, leading Briar through the hidden paths of the mountains, their bodies brushing against hers, a reassuring presence in the darkness. The moon, full and bright, cast an ethereal glow over the landscape, illuminating the snow-covered peaks and the dark, shadowy valleys. Briar's mind was focused, her determination unwavering. She had to find Kaelin, not just to stop him, but to prove something to Ryland, to bridge the chasm that had opened between them. She had to show him that she was still Briar, despite the power that now flowed through her veins, despite the transformation she had undergone. As they journeyed, she thought about Ryland, about his fear, his doubt, his unspoken accusation. She understood his reaction. He had seen her change, become something other, something wild, something unpredictable, something potentially dangerous. But she wasn't a monster. She wasn't a creature of darkness. She was still the woman he had claimed in the town square, the woman he had sworn to protect, the woman he was, however reluctantly, bound to. She had to make him see that. She had to make him understand. After several hours, the wolves stopped at the edge of a deep ravine, their bodies tense, their ears pricked. They whined softly, their eyes fixed on something in the darkness below. Briar followed their gaze, her heart pounding in her chest. She could see a faint light flickering in the distance, the glow of a campfire. She could smell the scent of wood smoke, and something else, something metallic, something acrid, that made her stomach churn. It was Kaelin. She was sure of it. She turned to the wolves, her hand resting on the large wolf's fur. "Stay here," she whispered. "I'll go alone." The wolves hesitated, their eyes filled with concern, but they obeyed. They were her allies, but this was her battle, her confrontation. Briar descended into the ravine, her movements cautious and deliberate. The terrain was treacherous, loose rocks and crumbling earth threatening to send her tumbling into the darkness. But she pressed on, her focus unwavering, her determination fueled by a mixture of fear and resolve. As she neared the campfire, she could hear voices, low and murmuring. She crept closer, concealing herself behind a large boulder, her senses on high alert. She saw Kaelin, sitting by the fire, his face illuminated by the flickering flames. He was sharpening his silver whistle, the one he had used to inflict such pain on her, the one that was the key to his control over the wolves. He was not alone. There were several other figures with him, men and women dressed in dark clothing, their faces grim and determined. They were hunters, she realized, members of Kaelin's order, dedicated to eradicating the Hollowfangs, to wiping out the taint of the supernatural. Briar listened to their conversation, her blood running cold. They were planning their next move, discussing how to track down Ryland, how to capture her, how to purify the land. They spoke of the sanctuary, of its defenses, of its weaknesses. They were a threat, not just to her and Ryland, but to everything she had come to believe in, to everything she was now a part of. She knew she had to stop them. But how? She was outnumbered, outgunned, and Kaelin held the key to her power, the silver whistle that could cripple her with a single note. She closed her eyes, took a deep breath, and focused on the silver ring on her finger. She remembered Alara's words, "You are the key to restoring the balance." She remembered the woman in the cavern, the power she had wielded, the connection she had shared with the wolves. She opened her eyes, her gaze fixed on Kaelin. She stepped out from behind the boulder, her body straight, her head held high. "Kaelin," she said, her voice clear and strong, echoing in the stillness of the night. Kaelin looked up, his eyes widening in surprise. He jumped to his feet, his hand instinctively reaching for his whistle. The other hunters turned, their weapons drawn, their faces hardening. "You," Kaelin hissed, his voice filled with hatred. "How did you find us?" Briar didn't answer. She simply stood there, her gaze unwavering, her presence radiating a quiet strength, a power that belied her outward appearance. "It doesn't matter," Kaelin said, his lips curling into a cruel smile. "You're alone. You're outnumbered. You're powerless." He raised the whistle to his lips, ready to blow the note that would bring her to her knees. But before he could, a voice, strong and resonant, echoed through the ravine. "She's not alone." Ryland stepped out from the shadows, his golden eyes burning in the firelight. He stood beside Briar, his body a shield, his presence a reassurance. The wolves emerged behind him. He looked at Briar, his gaze filled with something she hadn't seen in his eyes since before the transformation. It was admiration, it was respect, it was love. "I'm sorry," he said, his voice low, meant only for her. "I was afraid. I didn't understand. But I do now. I see you, Briar. All of you. And I love you." His words were a balm to her soul, a healing salve to the wounds of doubt and fear. She reached out and took his hand, her fingers interlacing with his. A surge of energy passed between them, a spark of connection that was stronger, deeper than ever before. Kaelin, seeing their united front, seeing the wolves at their backs, seeing the power that radiated from them, knew he was defeated. Again. He lowered the whistle, his face contorted in rage. This isn't over," he snarled. "I'll be back." And he would never finish his threat. Ryland and Briar, their power melded, moved as one. The battle had begun. Or perhaps a different kind of battle altogether. Chapter 14. The Curse of the Crimson Moon. Ryland and Briar moved with a synchronized grace, a dance of power and unity that belied the chaos of the situation. Ryland, his movements fluid and precise, engaged the hunters, his knife a blur of silver in the firelight. Briar, drawing on the power of the Hollowborn, focused on Kaelin, her eyes locked on his, her will unwavering. The wolves, no longer under Kaelin's control, joined the fray, their snarls and growls filling the ravine, their teeth and claws tearing at the hunters' ranks. They fought with a fierce loyalty, their allegiance now firmly with Briar and Ryland. Kaelin, despite his initial bravado, was quickly overwhelmed. He tried to use his whistle to regain control of the wolves, to cripple Briar, but his efforts were futile. The bond between Briar and the pack was too strong, her will too powerful, fueled by Ryland's love and her own burgeoning confidence. He stumbled back, his eyes wide with fear, his face pale. He looked from Briar to Ryland, from the wolves to his dwindling number of hunters, his carefully laid plans crumbling around him. This isn't possible," he stammered, his voice trembling. You can't defeat me. I am the chosen one. I am destined to you, are destined to fail." "Kaelin," Briar said, her voice cold and clear, cutting through his rambling. "Your hatred, your fear, your obsession with control, it has blinded you. It has made you weak." She raised her hand, her palm facing him, and focused her power, the power of the Hollowborn, the power of the ancient pact, the power of her connection to Ryland. A surge of energy, visible as a shimmering wave of light, emanated from her hand, striking Kaelin with the force of a physical blow. He cried out, his body arching, his eyes rolling back in his head. The silver whistle slipped from his grasp, clattering to the ground. He collapsed unconscious, his body limp and still. The remaining hunters, seeing their leader fall, seeing the power arrayed against them, surrendered, dropping their weapons, their faces filled with terror. The battle was over. Briar lowered her hand, her body trembling with the aftershocks of the power she had wielded. She felt exhausted, drained, but also victorious. She had faced her fears, confronted her enemy, and emerged triumphant. Ryland came to her side, his arm wrapping around her waist, supporting her. He looked at her, his golden eyes filled with pride, with love, with awe. "You were amazing," he said, his voice hoarse. You saved us all." Briar leaned into him, her head resting on his shoulder. She felt his warmth, his strength, his love, and it was a balm to her soul, a healing salve to the wounds of the battle. "We did it together," she said, her voice soft. "We're a team." The wolves gathered around them, their bodies pressing against them, their soft whines a chorus of gratitude and loyalty. They were a pack, a family, bound together by a shared destiny, by a power that transcended the boundaries of human and wolf. But the victory was short-lived. As they stood there, basking in the aftermath of the battle, the moon, which had been full and bright, began to change. It turned a deep, crimson red, casting an eerie, blood-red glow over the landscape. Alara's voice, filled with alarm, echoed from the entrance of the ravine, where she had arrived with several other members of the sanctuary. "The Crimson Moon!"
she cried.
"It's the curse! It's happening!" Briar and Ryland looked at each other, their eyes filled with confusion and dread. "The curse?" Ryland asked. "What curse?" Alara rushed towards them, her face pale and drawn. "The curse of the Crimson Moon," she explained, her voice trembling. "It's an ancient prophecy, a curse laid upon the Hollowfangs, upon those who break the pact, upon those who wield the power without understanding." She looked at Briar, her eyes filled with a mixture of pity and fear. "It's a curse of madness, of bloodlust, of uncontrollable transformation. It's a curse that consumes." Briar felt a chill run down her spine. The Crimson Moon, the curse. It was all starting to make a terrifying, unsettling kind of sense. The dreams, the visions, the growing wildness within her, the moments of lost control. "But I thought we broke the curse," Briar said, her voice trembling. "By fulfilling the pact, the pact was only part of it," Alara interrupted, her voice urgent. "The true curse lies in the misuse of the power, in the imbalance between human and wolf, in the temptation of darkness." She looked at Ryland, her eyes pleading. "You must help her, Ryland. You must guide her. You must control her. Before it's too late." Ryland's face hardened, his jaw clenching. He looked at Briar, his golden eyes filled with a mixture of love and fear. He knew what he had to do. He had to protect her, from the curse, from herself. But as the crimson light bathed them, a low growl started to build. Not from Ryland, from Briar. And it wasn't directed at their defeated enemies. Chapter 15. Flight through the shadowed veil. The growl, deep and resonant, vibrated through the air, a primal sound that sent shivers down Ryland's spine. He looked at Briar, his eyes filled with a dawning horror, a sickening realization of what was happening. The Crimson Moon's light intensified, bathing Briar in its blood-red glow. Her eyes, which had been hazel, flecked with gold, were now burning with a fierce, predatory light, the pupils dilated, the irises almost entirely gold. Her skin seemed to shimmer, her muscles coiling, her bones shifting beneath the surface. The transformation was beginning again, but this time, it was different. It was not the controlled, purposeful shift she had experienced before, the one fueled by necessity and directed by will. This was something else, something darker, something wilder. "Briar," Ryland said, his voice urgent, desperate. "Fight it. Don't let it take you." He reached for her, his hand outstretched, but Alara grabbed his arm, pulling him back.
"No," she cried.
"It's too late. The curse has taken hold. You can't reach her now." Briar turned towards Ryland, her face contorted in a snarl, her teeth bared. The growl intensified, a sound of pure, untamed rage, a sound that ripped through the night. Ryland stared at her, his heart breaking. He saw the woman he loved, the woman he had sworn to protect, slipping away, consumed by a power she couldn't control, a curse he hadn't understood. "Briar, please," he pleaded, his voice cracking. "It's me. It's Ryland. Don't you recognize me?" But there was no recognition in her eyes, no flicker of the woman he knew. There was only the wolf, the Hollowfang, unleashed and untamed. She lunged, not at the defeated hunters, not at Alara, but at Ryland. He stumbled back, narrowly avoiding her claws, his eyes wide with shock and pain. Alara pulled him away, her grip surprisingly strong. "We have to go," she shouted. "We can't help her now. We have to get to safety." Ryland resisted, his gaze fixed on Briar, his heart torn between his love for her and his fear of what she had become.
"No,"
he cried. "I won't leave her. I can't." But Alara was relentless. She dragged him away, forcing him to retreat, to flee from the woman he loved, from the creature she had become. The wolves, sensing the shift in Briar, sensing the danger, backed away, their bodies low to the ground, their eyes filled with confusion and fear. They didn't attack, but they didn't follow. They were caught between their loyalty to Briar and their instinct for self-preservation. Briar, consumed by the curse, watched them go, her eyes burning with a predatory hunger. She let out a howl, a long, mournful sound that echoed through the ravine, a sound of loss, of rage, of despair. Then, she turned and ran, disappearing into the darkness, her movements swift and silent, her form blending with the shadows. Ryland, Alara, and the remaining members of the sanctuary fled in the opposite direction, their hearts heavy with grief and fear. They ran through the night, guided by the faint light of the stars, their path treacherous and uncertain. They reached a hidden valley, a place shrouded in mist, a place where the ancient magic still held sway. It was a place of refuge, a place of shadows, a place where they could hide, for a time, from the wrath of the crimson moon, from the fury of the Hollowborn. Ryland collapsed to the ground, his body trembling, his mind reeling. He had lost her. He had failed her. He had failed to protect her, to control her, to save her from the curse. Alara knelt beside him, her hand resting on his shoulder, her eyes filled with compassion. "It's not your fault, Ryland," she said, her voice soft. "The curse is powerful. It's ancient. It's almost impossible to resist." Ryland shook his head, his eyes filled with tears. "I should have known," he said, his voice hoarse. "I should have seen it coming. I should have. You did everything you could," Alara interrupted, her voice firm. "You loved her. You protected her. You fought for her. That's all anyone can do." She looked out into the darkness, towards the direction Briar had fled.
"She's still out there," she said.
"The curse may have taken hold, but she's still Briar. Somewhere, deep down, she's still fighting." Ryland looked up at her, his eyes filled with a flicker of hope. "You think so?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. Alara nodded. "I know so," she said. "The bond between you is strong. It's ancient. It's powerful. It can't be broken so easily." She stood up, her gaze fixed on the distant mountains. "We have to find her, Ryland," she said. "We have to help her. We have to break the curse." But how could they possibly break a curse that was centuries old, a curse that was fueled by the very power that flowed through Briar's veins? And how could he face her again, knowing what she had become, knowing the danger she posed? The love was still there, but so was the terror. Chapter 16. The Citadel of Lost Souls. The days that followed were a blur of fear, grief, and desperate planning. Ryland, haunted by the image of Briar's transformed state, by the memory of her lunging at him, struggled to reconcile the woman he loved with the creature she had become. He was torn between his desire to find her, to help her, and his terror of facing her again, of witnessing the full force of the curse. Alara, wise and resourceful, guided their efforts. She consulted ancient texts, deciphered cryptic prophecies, and sought guidance from the spirits of the sanctuary. She discovered that the curse of the Crimson Moon was not merely a random affliction, but a deliberate act of malice, a curse laid upon the Hollowfangs by a rival clan, centuries ago, in a bid for power and dominance. The curse, she learned, was tied to the lunar cycle, reaching its peak during the Crimson Moon, a rare celestial event that amplified the power of the Hollowborn, but also twisted it, turning it into a force of destruction and madness. The only way to break the curse, according to the texts, was to find the source of the original magic, the place where the curse had been cast, and perform a ritual of purification, a ritual that required the blood of the cursed one and the sacrifice of something precious. Alara believed that the source of the curse was located in the Citadel of Lost Souls, a ruined fortress high in the mountains, a place shrouded in darkness and despair, a place where the spirits of the dead were said to roam. It was a dangerous journey, a perilous quest, but it was their only hope of saving Briar, of breaking the curse. Ryland, despite his fear, agreed to go. He knew he couldn't abandon Briar, not to the curse, not to the madness. He had to try, he had to fight, even if it meant facing his own terror, even if it meant risking his own life. They prepared for the journey, gathering supplies, arming themselves with weapons and protective charms, seeking guidance from the spirits of the sanctuary. The wolves, who had remained loyal to Briar, even in her transformed state, offered their assistance, their senses keen, their instinct sharp, their loyalty unwavering. They set out at dawn, a small band of warriors, venturing into the heart of the mountains, towards the citadel of lost souls, their path fraught with danger, their hearts filled with a mixture of hope and dread. The journey was arduous, the terrain treacherous, the weather unforgiving. They faced blizzards, avalanches, and the constant threat of attack from creatures drawn to the darkness of the curse. But they pressed on, driven by their determination to save Briar, to break the curse. As they neared the citadel, the air grew colder, the landscape more desolate, the sense of unease more palpable. The trees were twisted and gnarled, their branches bare and skeletal, their leaves long since withered and decayed. The ground was barren and rocky, devoid of life, covered in a layer of frost and ice. The citadel itself was a formidable sight, a massive structure of black stone, its walls crumbling, its towers broken, its windows dark and empty. It was a place of shadows, of whispers, of forgotten memories, a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the spirits of the dead were said to linger. They approached the citadel cautiously, their weapons drawn, their senses on high alert. The wolves, their fur bristling, their eyes gleaming, moved ahead, scouting the area, sniffing the air for any sign of danger. As they entered the main courtyard, they were met by a chilling sight. The ground was littered with bones, the remains of those who had perished within the citadel's walls, victims of the curse, victims of the darkness. The air was thick with the scent of decay, of death, of despair. And then they heard it, a howl, long and mournful, echoing through the ruins, a sound of pure, untamed anguish. It was Briar. Ryland's heart ached at the sound. He knew she was close. He knew she was suffering. He knew he had to reach her, to help her. But as he moved towards the sound, a figure emerged from the shadows, blocking his path. It was a spirit, a wraith, a creature of darkness, its form shimmering and indistinct, its eyes burning with a cold, malevolent light. It was a guardian of the citadel, a protector of the curse, a servant of the ancient evil that resided within. And behind it, more spirits, more wraiths, more creatures of darkness, emerging from the shadows, their forms coalescing, their eyes fixed on Ryland and his companions. They were surrounded. They were outnumbered. They were facing an enemy unlike any they had encountered before. Ryland drew his knife, his body tense, his heart pounding. He looked at Alara, at the wolves, at the members of the sanctuary who had accompanied them. They were ready. They were prepared to fight. They were prepared to die, if necessary, to save Briar, to break the curse. The battle began, a clash of steel and magic, of light and darkness, of hope and despair. It would be a battle to save Briar, or save themselves. Or both. Or neither. And he could hear Briar howling again, closer this time. The sound was getting closer. Chapter 17. A bond forged in fire. The spirits attacked with a ferocity that was both terrifying and mesmerizing. They moved with an unnatural speed, their forms flickering and shifting, their touch cold and draining, their presence chilling the very air around them. Ryland fought with a desperate courage, his knife flashing, his movements precise, but the spirits were difficult to harm, their bodies insubstantial, their attacks relentless. He felt their cold touch, draining his strength, chilling his soul, but he pressed on, driven by his love for Briar, by his determination to save her. Alara, wielding her staff, chanted ancient incantations, her voice strong and clear, her magic a beacon of light in the encroaching darkness. She summoned protective shields, unleashed blasts of energy, and called upon the spirits of the sanctuary to aid them in their battle. The wolves fought with a fierce loyalty, their teeth and claws tearing at the spirits' forms, their howls echoing through the ruins, a challenge to the darkness, a testament to their bond with Briar. The members of the sanctuary, armed with swords and bows, fought bravely, their skills honed by years of training, their hearts filled with a righteous fury, their determination fueled by their faith in Alara, in Ryland, in Briar. But despite their efforts, the spirits were overwhelming. They were too numerous, too powerful, too relentless. One by one, Ryland's companions fell, their bodies succumbing to the cold, draining touch of the wraiths, their spirits joining the legions of the lost. Ryland found himself alone, surrounded by enemies, his strength failing, his hope dwindling. He had lost his companions, he had failed in his quest, he was about to lose his life. And then he heard it again. The howl. Closer now, more intense, more desperate. He looked up and saw her. Briar. She stood on the ramparts of the citadel, silhouetted against the crimson moon, her form transformed, her eyes burning with a golden light. She was the Hollowborn, the creature of the curse, the embodiment of the wildness he had both loved and feared. But there was something different about her now. The rage, the madness, the bloodlust, it was still there, but it was tempered. There was a flicker of recognition in her eyes, a hint of the woman he knew, a spark of the love they shared. She was fighting the curse. She was struggling to control it, to hold onto her humanity, to resist the darkness that threatened to consume her. Ryland knew what he had to do. He had to reach her. He had to help her. He had to remind her of who she was, of who they were together. He sheathed his knife, his hands empty, his body vulnerable. He took a deep breath and started to walk towards her, towards the spirits that surrounded him, towards the creature of the curse. The spirits attacked, their cold touch searing his skin, their presence draining his strength, but he didn't stop. He ignored the pain, ignored the fear, ignored the whispers of despair that echoed in his mind. He focused on Briar, on her eyes, on the flicker of recognition, on the spark of love. He called out to her, his voice strong and clear, filled with emotion. Briar, he shouted. It's me. It's Ryland. I love you. Don't let it take you. Fight it. Remember who you are. His words seemed to reach her. She hesitated, her body trembling, her eyes flickering between gold and hazel, her form shifting between human and wolf. The spirits intensified their attacks, sensing her weakening resolve, sensing the threat he posed to their control. They swarmed around him, their cold touch almost unbearable, their whispers growing louder, more insistent. But Ryland didn't falter. He kept walking, kept calling out to her, his voice filled with love, with hope, with faith. He reached the base of the ramparts, the spirits closing in, their touch threatening to overwhelm him. He looked up at Briar, his eyes meeting hers. I love you, Briar, he said, his voice a whisper, his strength almost gone. I'll always love you, no matter what. And then it happened. A surge of power, raw and untamed, erupted from Briar. It was the power of the Hollowborn, but it was different now. It was not the chaotic, destructive force of the curse, but something controlled, something focused. She threw back her head and howled, a sound that was both a cry of pain and a roar of defiance. The sound shattered the spirits, dispersing them into nothingness, their forms dissolving into the shadows. The crimson moon, which had been hanging heavy in the sky, began to fade, its blood-red glow diminishing, its power waning. Briar, her body trembling, her form shifting, slowly returned to her human shape. She collapsed to her knees, her eyes filled with tears, her body exhausted, her spirit drained. Ryland rushed to her side, his arms wrapping around her, holding her close. He felt her warmth, her softness, her humanity, and it was the most beautiful thing he had ever felt. I'm here, Briar, he whispered, his voice choked with emotion. I'm here. You're safe now. You're back. The bond, forged through trials and terror, remained unbroken, perhaps even stronger. But the curse was not broken. Not yet. Chapter 18. Reclaiming the Stolen Heart. Briar clung to Ryland, her body shaking, her mind reeling from the battle, from the transformation, from the near loss of herself. She had been on the precipice of darkness, on the verge of succumbing to the curse, but his voice, his love, his unwavering faith in her had pulled her back, had given her the strength to fight, to reclaim her humanity. "Ryland," she whispered, her voice hoarse, her throat raw from the howls. I almost lost it. But you didn't," he said, his voice firm, his arms tightening around her. "You fought it. You won. You're stronger than the curse, Briar." She looked up at him, her eyes searching his, her heart filled with a mixture of gratitude and shame. She had attacked him. She had threatened him. She had almost killed him. "I hurt you," she said, her voice trembling. "I could have it wasn't you." "Briar," he interrupted, his voice gentle. "It was the curse. It wasn't you." He touched her face, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw, his eyes filled with love, with forgiveness, with understanding. "I know who you are, Briar," he said. "I know your heart. I know your strength. And I know you would never hurt me. Not willingly." His words were a balm to her soul, a healing salve to the wounds of guilt and fear. She leaned into him, her head resting on his chest, her body finding comfort in his warmth, in his strength, in his presence. But the curse was still there, a lingering threat, a shadow that hung over them. The crimson moon had faded, but its power was not entirely gone. The citadel of lost souls was still a place of darkness, a place of danger, a place where the spirits of the dead still roamed. Alara, who had survived the battle, along with a handful of the sanctuary members, approached them, her face etched with concern. "The curse is not broken," she said, her voice grave. "We have dispelled the spirits, for now, but the source of the magic remains. We must find it and perform the ritual before the next crimson moon." Ryland nodded, his resolve hardening. He knew they couldn't rest, they couldn't celebrate, not yet. The battle was won, but the war was far from over. "Where is it?" he asked. "Where is the source of the curse?" Alara pointed towards the highest tower of the citadel, a crumbling structure that pierced the sky, its peak shrouded in mist. "There," she said, "in the Chamber of Shadows. It's where the original curse was cast, centuries ago. It's where the power resides." They set out towards the tower, their steps cautious, their senses on high alert. The citadel was still a dangerous place, its corridors filled with traps, its chambers haunted by lingering spirits, its very stones imbued with the darkness of the curse. They navigated the ruins, guided by Alara's knowledge, by Ryland's instincts, by Briar's connection to the Hollowborn. She could feel the power of the curse, its pull, its temptation, but she resisted it, her will strengthened by Ryland's love, by her determination to be free. As they climbed the winding staircase of the tower, the air grew colder, the darkness more intense, the sense of unease more palpable. They could hear whispers, echoes of the past, fragments of conversations, snippets of rituals, the voices of the dead, trapped within the citadel's walls. Finally, they reached the Chamber of Shadows. It was a large, circular room, its walls lined with ancient carvings, its floor covered in a mosaic of strange symbols, its ceiling open to the sky. In the center of the room was a stone altar, stained with blood, its surface cold and smooth. This was it, the source of the curse, the place where it all began. Alara began to prepare for the ritual, laying out her herbs, her crystals, her talismans, her voice chanting ancient incantations, her magic weaving a protective circle around them. Ryland stood beside Briar, his hand resting on her shoulder, his presence a source of strength, of comfort, of love. He knew the ritual required her blood, a sacrifice of her essence, a mingling of her power with the ancient magic. But Alara had also spoken of another sacrifice, something precious, something that would be lost forever. He didn't know what it was, but he feared it, he dreaded it, he suspected it. As Alara's chanting reached a crescendo, Briar stepped forward, towards the altar. She looked at Ryland, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resolve. "I'm ready," she said, her voice firm. She took a deep breath, and then, before anyone could stop her, she cut her palm. She let the blood, now distinctly gold-tinged, drip on the altar. The power built. The final sacrifice was still needed. Who would it be? Chapter 19. The Reckoning of Ancient Wrath. As Briar's blood mingled with the ancient magic of the altar, the Chamber of Shadows began to tremble. The air crackled with energy, the carvings on the walls seemed to writhe and twist, the symbols on the floor glowed with an unearthly light. The whispers of the dead grew louder, more insistent, their voices swirling around them, filling the chamber with a cacophony of sound. Alara's chanting intensified, her voice rising above the din, her magic battling the darkness, her will focused on the ritual, on the purification, on the breaking of the curse. But the curse was not ready to be broken. It fought back, its power surging, its darkness resisting the light, its ancient wrath unleashed. The stone altar cracked, splitting in two, revealing a swirling vortex of black energy, a gateway to the realm of shadows, a portal to the source of the curse. From the vortex emerged a figure, a creature of darkness, a being of pure malevolence. It was the spirit of the ancient sorcerer who had cast the curse centuries ago, the one who had sought to control the Hollowfangs, to harness their power for his own twisted purposes. He was tall and gaunt, his body shrouded in shadows, his face a skull-like mask, his eyes burning with a cold, malevolent fire. He held in his hand a staff of black wood, its tip glowing with a pulsating, crimson light. He looked at Briar, his gaze piercing, his voice a chilling whisper that echoed through the chamber. "You cannot break the curse," he said. "It is eternal. It is me." He raised his staff, pointing it at Briar, unleashing a blast of dark energy, a wave of pure malice that struck her with the force of a physical blow. Briar cried out, staggering back, her body reeling from the impact. Ryland rushed to her side, supporting her, shielding her with his body. "Briar," he shouted, his voice filled with alarm. "Are you all right?" She nodded, her face pale, her body trembling, but her eyes still burning with determination. "I'm okay," she said, her voice strained. "But he's strong. Too strong." Alara, her chanting uninterrupted, her magic focused on the ritual, called out to them. "The sacrifice," she cried. "The final sacrifice. It's the only way." Ryland looked at Briar, his eyes filled with a mixture of fear and understanding. He knew what the sacrifice was. He had suspected it all along. It was the ring. The silver ring. The symbol of their bond. The mark of the Hollowfang. The connection to her power. It was the key to breaking the curse, but it was also the key to their love, to their connection, to their destiny. He reached for her hand, his fingers gently touching the ring. He looked into her eyes, his gaze searching, his heart aching. "Briar," he said, his voice soft, his voice filled with a profound sadness. I have to." She understood. She knew what he had to do. She had known it all along, deep down, in the hidden recesses of her heart. She nodded, her eyes filled with tears, her voice barely a whisper. "Do it," she said. "Break the curse. Set us free." Ryland hesitated, his fingers trembling. He looked at the ring, the symbol of their love, the token of their bond, the promise of their future. Could he do it? Could he sacrifice their connection, their love, their everything? He looked at Briar, at her eyes, at her strength, at her courage, at her love.
He knew he had to.
For her.
For them.
For the future. He took a deep breath, and with a swift, decisive movement, he pulled the ring from her finger. The moment the ring left her hand, a shockwave of energy rippled through the chamber. The vortex of black energy that had spawned the sorcerer pulsed violently. The sorcerer screamed, a sound of pure rage and agony, his form flickering, his power waning. Ryland, holding the ring aloft, stepped towards the vortex. He looked at the sorcerer, his eyes filled with defiance, with courage, with love. "The curse is broken," he shouted, his voice echoing through the chamber. "You have no power here anymore." And with that, he threw the ring into the vortex. The effect was instantaneous. The vortex imploded, collapsing in on itself, drawing the sorcerer's spirit with it, his screams fading into silence, his form dissolving into nothingness. The chamber of shadows was silent, the darkness gone, the whispers stilled, the curse broken. Briar felt a wave of relief wash over her, a sense of liberation, of peace. She was free. They were free. But she also felt a pang of loss, a sense of emptiness, a void where the ring had been, where the connection to Ryland, to the Hollowfang, had resided. It was a small price to pay, she told herself.
But was it?
The sorcerer's final words echoed, though his physical form was gone. It is eternal.
It is not me.
Chapter 20. The final confrontation of hearts. The silence in the Chamber of Shadows was profound, broken only by the ragged breathing of Ryland and Briar and the faint crackling of the dying embers of Alara's protective circle. The darkness had receded, the spirits had vanished, the curse was broken. But the victory felt hollow, tinged with a sense of loss, of uncertainty. The silver ring, the symbol of their bond, the connection to Briar's power, was gone. And with it, a part of their connection, a part of their shared destiny, seemed to have vanished as well. Briar looked at her hand, at the empty space where the ring had been, her heart aching. She felt a strange sense of nakedness, of vulnerability, as if a part of her had been stripped away, leaving her exposed and uncertain. Ryland, standing beside her, felt it too. The absence of the ring, the severing of the connection, it was a physical void, a palpable emptiness that resonated between them. He reached for her hand, his fingers gently touching hers, his eyes searching hers. He wanted to reassure her, to comfort her, to tell her that everything was all right, that their love was still strong, that their bond was still unbroken. But the words wouldn't come. He felt a distance between them, a subtle shift in their dynamic, a hesitation. Briar, he began, his voice hesitant, his voice filled with a mixture of relief and uncertainty. Are you all right? She nodded, her face pale, her eyes avoiding his. Yes, she said, her voice soft, her voice lacking its usual warmth. I'm free. The curse is broken. We did it. But her words felt hollow, her tone distant, her body language guarded. She was withdrawing from him, pulling away, creating a space between them. Alara, sensing the tension, approached them, her face etched with concern. She had witnessed the sacrifice. She had felt the severing of the bond. She understood the implications. The curse is broken, she said, her voice grave. But the price was high. The ring, it was more than just a symbol. It was a conduit, a connection, a part of you both. She looked at Briar, her eyes filled with compassion. You are free from the curse, Briar, she said. But you are also changed. You are no longer the Hollowfang's bride. You are yourself. Alone. Her words were like a knife to Briar's heart. Alone. That was the word that echoed in her mind, the word that described the emptiness she felt, the void that had opened up within her. She looked at Ryland, her eyes searching his, her heart aching. She wanted to reach out to him, to hold him, to feel his warmth, his love, his connection. But she couldn't. She felt a barrier between them, a wall of uncertainty, of fear. She had chosen to break the curse, to sacrifice the ring, to sever the bond. She had made the choice for them for the future. But now, standing here, in the aftermath of the battle, in the silence of the Chamber of Shadows, she wondered if she had made the right choice. She had freed herself from the curse, but had she also freed herself from him? Ryland, sensing her withdrawal, her fear, her uncertainty, felt his own heart ache. He had sacrificed the ring, the symbol of their love, the connection to her power, to save her, to break the curse. But in doing so, had he also sacrificed their relationship, their bond, their future? He looked at her, his eyes pleading, his voice soft, his voice filled with a desperate hope.
Briar, he said.
We can still be together. The ring, it was just a symbol. Our love, it's stronger than that. Isn't it? His words hung in the air, a question, a plea, a challenge. Briar looked at him, her eyes filled with tears, her heart torn between her love for him and her fear of the unknown, of the emptiness she felt, of the change within her. She didn't know the answer. She didn't know if their love was strong enough to overcome the sacrifice, to bridge the distance, to heal the wound. She didn't know if she was strong enough. She took a deep breath, her body trembling, her mind racing. She had a choice to make. A final choice. A choice between fear and love, between isolation and connection, between the past and the future. She looked at Ryland, at his eyes, at his love, at his hope. And she made her choice. I don't know, she said, her voice barely a whisper, her voice filled with a raw honesty. I don't know if our love is strong enough. I don't know if I'm strong enough. She took a step back, away from him, her hand reaching up to touch her chest, to the place where her heart beat, to the place where the emptiness resided. I need time, she said. I need space. I need to find myself. Again. Ryland's face fell, his hope diminishing, his heart breaking. He understood. He respected her choice. He had to. He nodded, his eyes filled with tears, his voice choked with emotion.
I understand, he said.
I'll give you whatever you need. He turned and walked away, leaving her alone in the chamber of shadows, leaving her to face her demons, to confront her fears, to find her way. He knew she needed to.
Alone.
But this was a different kind of alone, wasn't it?
A choice.
Not a curse. What would Briar choose? Epilogue. The years that followed were a journey of self-discovery, of healing, of redefinition. Briar, no longer bound by the curse, no longer defined by the title of the Hollowfang's bride, embarked on a quest to find her own identity, her own purpose, her own power. She left the sanctuary, venturing out into the world, seeking knowledge, seeking experience, seeking herself. She traveled to distant lands, met different people, learned ancient traditions, explored forgotten magic. She discovered that the power of the Hollowfang was not entirely gone. It was still within her, a part of her, but it was different now. It was no longer a wild, untamed force, a curse to be feared, but a source of strength, of intuition, of connection. She learned to control it, to wield it, to use it for good, for healing, for protection. She became a guardian, a protector, a healer. She helped those in need, fought against injustice, and sought to bring balance to the world. She never forgot Ryland. His memory was a constant presence in her heart, a reminder of the love they had shared, of the sacrifice they had made, of the bond that had been broken. She often wondered about him, about his life, about his happiness. She hoped he had found peace, that he had moved on, that he had found someone else to share his life with. But she never sought him out. She respected the choice she had made, the space she had needed, the distance she had created. She believed it was for the best for both of them. One day, many years later, she found herself back in Oakhaven, the town where it had all begun. It was autumn, the leaves turning gold and red, the air crisp and cool, the scent of wood smoke filling the air. The town had changed, but it was still familiar. The harvest festival was underway, the square filled with people, with laughter, with music. But there were no flickering torches, no fear of the wolves, no broken boundaries. She walked through the square, unnoticed, a stranger in her own hometown. She saw familiar faces, older now, weathered by time, but still recognizable. She saw Elias, the blacksmith, his hair now completely white, his shoulders stooped, but his smile still gentle, his eyes still kind. And then she saw him, Ryland. He was standing by the edge of the square, watching the festivities, his back to her. He was older, his hair streaked with silver, his shoulders broader, his presence calmer. He hadn't changed. Not really. She hesitated, her heart pounding in her chest. Should she approach him? Should she speak to him? Should she reopen the past? She didn't know. She was afraid. Afraid of the rejection, afraid of the pain, afraid of the uncertainty. But she also felt a pull, a draw, a connection. It wasn't the magical bond of the Hollowfang. It wasn't the power of the curse. It was something else, something deeper. It was love. She took a deep breath and started to walk towards him. As she approached, he turned, as if sensing her presence. His eyes met hers. And in that moment, time seemed to stand still. The years melted away, the distance vanished, the uncertainty disappeared.
There was only them.
He smiled, a slow, hesitant smile, but a smile that reached his eyes, a smile that spoke of recognition of love. "Briar," he said, his voice soft, his voice filled with a warmth that melted the years of ice around her heart. "Ryland," she replied, her voice trembling, her voice filled with a hope she had thought long lost. They stood there, looking at each other, their eyes speaking volumes, their hearts reaching out, their souls reconnecting. There were no words, no explanations, no apologies. There was only love. A love that had endured the test of time, the sacrifice of the ring, the breaking of the curse, the journey of self-discovery. A love that was stronger, deeper, truer than ever before. He reached out his hand, and she took it. Their fingers interlaced, a familiar gesture, a comforting connection, a promise. They walked into the festival, together, not as the Hollow Fong and his bride, but as Briar and Ryland. Two souls, finally, truly free.
The end.